Okay. Hang on one second here. I'll undo my. So this morning I spoke with both Greg and Ed, and we went through the forecast, the financial forecast for the co-op that we're putting together as part of the private sale, as well as just having a good financial roadmap for the co-op as it builds out the platform. And last week, I know Greg shared the staffing model. And so that is one of the primary costs, but uh, we've also been looking at some of the other costs that'll be critical for the platform's success, marketing cost being, a very large part of that. And also spending time really on what the revenue is going to look like and the number of users. And we had a really good discussion for me on what a transaction is going to be on the platform, and how once there are applications that are built on the platform that really are designed for user engagement, like a social media or a music site, that the number of transactions can grow quite significantly, and that as the transactions grow, it'll give the co-op an opportunity to sort of set where the transaction cost. So it might be the transaction costs as it's launching are at one level, but after a couple of months they start coming down because of the number of transactions just grows astronomically. I'm very pleased with the forecast. I've got to make some additional changes to it based on what Greg and Ed provided this morning, but I think it's a really compelling story. Is there anything that I missed, Greg?
No, that was awesome. I really appreciate that, and it's just it's really nice when someone from the financial side of things is also beginning to see that picture. I mean, I think as engineers, it's kind of in our bones. I think Mike and I are like, we just kind of run, message count estimates or transaction estimates in our heads, and are able to go, oh wow, this is going to be a lot. but it's really nice when someone on the finance side also begins to see that. And I think you also said something that was very important, which is that the co-op is going to match the cost of transaction. In other words, the amount of rev necessary for transactions. We're going to track the amount that is required to keep the co-op going, and to grow the co-op at a reasonable rate. And so the price of transactions comes down, as Lisa said, over time. And our aim is not for this to be this giant money making machine, but rather that it's a common platform that's owned by the membership, in order to support all the applications, which is where we see the value. And so I think that's that's something that I really want people to grasp and get a handle on, that we're completely committed to, that the membership really owns this platform. And we don't have to make the transaction cost in rev be super high in order to have a good commons where all the applications can be running. And I think we've seen kind of the opposite of that mentality recently in the cryptocurrency markets. Right. I mean, over the early part of the summer, the transaction fees were just eating us alive, and I think a lot of other people had that same experience. And that's it's not good for the whole cryptocurrency movement. It's not good for the decentralization movement. Rather, we have to protect the commons, so that we can have things like a decentralized social network. We can have things like a decentralized Uber. We can have things like a decentralized Instacart, right? Or Grubhub. or a decentralized GitHub. These are the kinds of services that I think everybody is looking forward to, but they vanish. They become simply infeasible if the transaction rates are too high. And so the co-op remains committed to making this be, this is part of the commons and is protected for the commons by the co-op. So end of soapbox, but it was, to me, this is a super important point. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it made sense, 100%.
Cool. So, Ed, Lisa, were there any other points we wanted to mention about the forecast?
Hey, not me. It's gonna take some more conversation. There's kind of an expected metrics and shapes and things like that. We'll talk about it more at 1 o'clock.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so moving along, we had a really good conversation at the there was an Rchain meetup at Perkins Coie. I was really struck by several things. First of all, each time we have these, I kind of do a quick scan to see how full the room is. And now the room was like every row, every table, was pretty much filled up. I mean, you could have packed more people in there, but it was really well attended, and not just well attended in terms of the number of people in seats, but also well attended in terms of people seemed very engaged. They were giving their full attention and asking really good questions. It was delightful. I mean, there was a mergers and acquisitions guy who was asking a lot of good questions about supply chain management, and what does blockchain mean in terms of supply chain management. And I thought there was vigorous and wonderful discussion around what it means to have, a trusted a trusted data source that no one's in charge of. How does that change supply chain management? So that was really very gratifying. The other thing that was very helpful to me is I am essentially debugging the white paper material through these kinds of presentations. So I unveiled a little bit more of the white paper material at the meetup, and that also got a lot of positive response. So that was good. I had also done kind of as a foreshadowing of things to come. Kenny Rowe and I met for coffee. Kenny is one of the founders of MakerDAO, and we're hoping that Kenny gets quite significantly engaged in Rchain. And I kind of gave him the preview of the white paper material. This is more material than I've given here in this venue. And he also had a lot of good comments. He helped with a lot of good questions, and so I got to actually debug the material twice. So I feel like even though I haven't released the paper, I am making considerable progress. So that was a very useful, both the individual meeting with Kenny and also the Rchain meetup at Perkins Coie. Ed, did you want to add anything about your impressions of the Perkins Coie meeting?
Oh, sorry about my camera. No, it was great meeting. We announced it about a week or week and a half ahead of the event, and I'm sure if we had done more promotion around it, we could have gotten more folks. We weren't all that broad in our announcement, somewhat intentionally. I kind of target the Ethereum community, and I target people we know around town. And just echo what Greg said. The quality of attendance was awesome. We had a local VC. We had at least 4 investors in the audience, that are relatively new to the conversation that are expressing some interest. We had a gentleman that wants to help, and Evan and I have talked to this guy about organizing a hackathon here in the Seattle area, and that hackathon would be, depending when it occurs, excuse me. Depending when it occurs, that would be either certainly contain some business ideas, and if it occurs later, more technical. Sorry, I got something in my throat. I'll come back later.
Cool. So yeah, so that was very. I just was super gratified by the level and quality of engagement. And then let's see some technical updates. Just yesterday, Mike and I had a really good conversation. I think Mike's on, so maybe he can jump in at any point. We've been evaluating the feasibility of doing an entirely proof theoretic type checking for the ladle or presentation of the ladle algorithm, so that the type checking algorithm is entirely proof theoretic, as opposed to ending up appealing to a model theoretic calculations, which potentially can be slower. And Mike came up with some really good counter examples to try to prove that we can't do only proof theoretic kinds of calculations. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, that we have at least one proposal that still has legs that allows us to think about this almost entirely proof theoretically, which could be to our advantage, again, in terms of performance. Did you want to say anything about that?
Mostly what the counterexample I came up with said that the piano arithmetic theory is incompatible with hiding algebras in much the same way that the SKI calculus is incompatible with lists as a collection. So we've got these two pieces in the ladle algorithm. One is a term language, which we're going to apply to row calculus. That'll be our term language. And the other is a notion of collection. And we've been thinking of hiding algebras because those capture the notion of subsets of the set of all terms. And in this case, I chose a very simple toy calculus and tried to combine it with the hiding algebra and found that it didn't work. We could use something just slightly simpler than hiding algebra and it worked. So the idea is that we need to figure out whether how do I put this? The proof theoretic stuff works fine in the slightly simpler case, the slightly more general notion. And so we can prove all sorts of subtyping relationships in that situation. I guess I haven't thought long enough about how to explain it well. It was, after all, just something we came up with yesterday. Yeah, yes, I believe that type theoretic stuff is still an option. We just have some caveats about when it can apply.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's a fairly good characterization. So that's I found that to be very gratifying. Also, we got some really good engagement from Express SOS reviewers. For the first time, I felt like we had really substantive reviewers. Of the reviewers on the paper, this was the row combinator paper, 2 accepted and 1 rejected, but the rejection was really quite good. What the reviewer actually said, they implore us to revise the paper and keep going with the research results. They rejected it because of a typo. I didn't find out about the deadline until it was pretty darn close. And so I committed a typo, and the reviewer couldn't see that it was a typo. I have subsequently fixed the typo in the paper. And it really was a typo. Not a. It would have been cool if it was a Thinko, but it wasn't. So I'll be making the revised version with the fixed typo up online probably today. So that will at least be available on archive, and then we'll resubmit it to another venue. Or again, it's the first time we really had someone who was reading close enough to make substantive comments about the paper, and that's exactly the kind of feedback we need. So it was kind of good news, bad news, but I was really glad. Again, with these kinds of things, we desperately need this kind of peer review in order to make sure that everything that we're doing is of the highest quality. So let's see, what else on the technical front? I can't think of anything right now. I'll have more to say probably next week, because we've got some things coming in with respect to sub projects within the project. So that'll be at a little further along. We did hire Chris to be working on the comms layer. So Chris, did you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you're doing?
Sure. That's right. I just started kind of ramping up over the last couple of weeks, and today is officially my first day full time.
Yay!
Yay! Much rejoicing. So right now, I need to figure out a whole bunch of stuff. There's a giant pile of information that I think any developer is going to have to at least get through to figure out what's important to the particular subsystem that he or she is working on. And I'm in that process. It's a good time to be in that process because the scope of the various projects is right now getting decided. So I get to be in on that part. There's a lot of new stuff here for me. I think everybody probably feels that way. But I'm really excited. And a lot of theories about how things should work.
Yeah.
So we'll find the best one.
Awesome. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. It's good to have you on board.
Thank you.
Chris and Nash and Navneet and I met a few weeks back, which led to us hiring Chris, and we had a really good conversation about the comms layer. So I'm feeling happy. I think it's in the right hands. So that's that. There was another point. Oh yeah. So we should give an update also about the private sale, because we have to pay for all the developer resources. So we spoke at length with Alex Bulkin yesterday to try to get a handle on kind of a checklist of things that we need in order to get the private sale underway, from their perspective. So that's getting solidified. We have some pretty clear ideas about that. And once it's even a little bit more solid, I'll share that with the communities in case anyone wants to pitch in and help. I mean, one thing we're definitely going to need to do is to, on the co-op site, begin to do a resource aggregation point for people. I think it's hard for people to find the architecture document. It's hard for people to find some of the other documentation about like the mobile processes for programming the blockchain, or some of the slide decks, or any of the other documentation. So we're going to need to add that, and so these are going to generate tasks if people want to jump in and help out with that. I've been thinking a lot about kind of a who, what, where, when, why, how kind of organization, sort of the typical journalist kinds of questions to organize the resources, and this is in connection with the feedback that we got from the Perkins Coie presentation. With the Perkins Coie presentation, what I ended up doing was focus on the why Rchain. And I think a lot of people felt that, providing sort of the why of it, the purpose and the significance of it, the meaning of it was help them even more than a deep dive technically. And so I think if we are if we organize the material kind of along those lines, it might be easy for people to jump off in terms of the things that they really want to see, and it might give it a kind of a simple shape for jumping off. But again, I'm not I don't even play website designer on TV, so I'm open to suggestions here. We're hoping that the private sale timeframe is going to commence in, let's say, the third week in August, something like that, and run through the second week in September. So that's the current thinking. That's not set in stone, but those are kind of the targets that we're looking for. And a lot of the materials that you've seen, like the forecast that Lisa presented, and the staffing model, and some of these other things are feeding into that. Also, we're in the process of redoing the milestone information that you have in the work breakdown structure, consolidating that into a simpler presentation that gives a sense of both the how and the when of Rchain. So I think for people who are really interested in a deep dive, the work breakdown structure, at least up through Mercury, is going to talk about how we execute, how we get from the few bits and algorithms that we've got to a blockchain that has the kind of scaling characteristics that we've been talking about. But we're going to need to take that 13 milestone and 30 row spreadsheet and consolidate it into something a little bit more high level, more rolled up. And so I'll be producing that, and that will also come with some timeline information, so people can be tracking our progress against the timeline. Let's see, is there anything else on the private sale? Ed, any other thoughts you wanted to add about the private sale?
No. Just as if there's people that are interested to send email, there's a private Slack channel that we could invite people to. And my understanding right now is that the private sale would be obviously invitation only, and it will be to qualified investors.
That's exactly right. Invitation only to qualified investors. And a part of this is because we really need to do some fairly significant KYC on this. And then the ICO, just so people are really clear, the ICO for the project happens post Mercury or concomitant with Mercury. So once Mercury is up and live and running, then that's when we will provide an ICO. And the ICO will be for Rev, and the rock will be convertible on a 1-for-1 basis to Rev. And at that point, from the co-op's point of view, the rock as a coupon will cease to be of significant value, right? It will cease. It will have fulfilled its role at that time. So that's so buying it now is like buying Rev later, and you get the corresponding discounts because you're coming in early. Okay, so I think that covers the private sale and all of the things that we wanted to talk about there. Were there any other? Let me just do a quick time check here. So, are there any other topics that we want to touch on? Any questions that people want to look at?
Yeah, this is also historical relevance. How long was Ethereum testing done before the launch of the mainnet back in beginning of 2015? My question really is, you have the design of Rchain, then you have to do public testing, right? So when is public testing available, and how long do you think that will take? Is it 2 weeks, 2 months? Like, because that is a significant thing you need to do. You have got to make sure that this can be launched to the public.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And again, what we've tried to suggest is a methodology for this that is supported by the namespacing features. So that with a particular namespace, you have an expectation of the quality of the operation, and you can keep expanding the namespaces that the functionality runs on. So yes, the testing, the public testing essentially begins at the point where we say, Mercury is now available. Once we say Mercury is now available, then anyone will be able to stand up nodes or log or begin submitting transactions against nodes that other people are running, and that will begin the public testing phase. And we expect that will go on for a good solid quarter before we would make any recommendations with respect to having significant value on the network.
Great, that's good to know.
Yeah. No, those are great questions, and I really appreciate it. I tried to also link this this idea of using namespacing for staging last week when we were talking about the methodology for testing, right? So how do you when you add new features, how do you manage that? Because even with significant formal methods available, there are still going to be bugs, and they may be bugs of different kinds. There may be bugs at scale, or there may be bugs that have to do with pressure and throughput. And so how do you find those kinds of things? And I firmly believe that testing in the wild is the right way to go to get the right kind of sort of unexpected or unusual combinations that really test the product. And so in order to test in the wild, you wrap up the feature inside a namespace and say, if you're going to be utilizing this functionality, it's only available in this namespace. And that's essentially what testnet versus namespace is all about. It's testnet versus mainnet is all about. Those are effectively namespaces. But with the Rchain, the whole idea becomes codified rather than somewhat random or somewhat ad hoc. And in this way, you can do this staged development method. So it's in this namespace, it's in test, 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 and then just test, test, and then just test, and then main. And those are and that's a sort of and the expectations in each of those namespaces is understood by the communities that are interacting with them. Cool. So that was a very useful question. Any other thoughts or questions or comments?
I was wondering, is there a relationship between the namespacing and the hiding algebras?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is it's not direct. So hiding algebra is just a notion of collection. So how do I explain this?
I guess my question is, do the hiding algebras, introduce inconsistencies that you have to embrace for a formal typing solution?
Yeah. So I mean, the question is actually really rich, and it's worth thinking about it in a little bit more detail, especially because Mike and Joe and I were all talking about these ideas a lot last week. So anytime you have a collection, and let's give some examples of collections so that we know what we mean when we say collection. An example of a collection would be a set. So a set can be thought of as an unordered list in which you have no duplicates. And those so if you were to think about it in terms of an aggregation operator, a kind of plus operator, which ultimately becomes set union. If I have set A and set B, then when I take their union, everything that's in the union, everything that's in A is in the union, and everything that's in B is in the union. If there's anything that's in A that's also in B, it's not duplicated. So in particular, that comes down to an equation of the form A union A is equal to A. So you can see that as a kind of equation rather than looking at it at the point or element level. Likewise, you know that A union B is the same as B union A. So you can see that as an equation which helps characterize the notion of set as a collection rather independently from the way you model it, right? You might model it under the covers with linked lists and some logic on top, or you might model it using arrays, or you might model it using any number of other kinds of data structures. But the interface that a user or a developer engages with for the set collection supports these equations that we were talking about. Now, the other side of this is that collections are ways of addressing things, and it's really easy to see this in the case of lists, right? So in the case of a list, you can give the index in the list, or if the list contains lists, you can give the index and then the next index and then the next index, and so on. So you can give these sort of multidimensional indexes, and that gives a way of addressing data inside the collection. More generally, all collections give a way of addressing data. They provide a means to locate data within the collection. And this idea of collections as locating devices is what connects the collection to a namespace. Since hiding algebras are kind of one of the weakest forms of collections that we use that notion of collections so that we can get a kind of coherence between the rewrite system. So the ladle algorithm is saying, give me a programming language. Well, if you have and you give me a collection, and I'll give you back a type system. So so in the case of a programming language, the rewrites are talking about how the programs evolve, and the notion of collection has to be coherent with this idea that programs evolve in time. And the hiding algebra is kind of the form of collection that's going to play nicely with the evolution of programs. So that's that's sort of what drives the choice of hiding algebra as a kind of collection. And so the design goals of the Ladle algorithm, there's certain desiderata, right? We're attempting to generate type systems for programming languages and virtual machines and things like that. So we need a notion of collection, but that notion of collection is directly related to locating data inside those collections. And so there is a relationship between namespacing and the hiding algebras. So the short answer to your question is yes. Now, how that relates to the notion of namespacing in Rchain is a little bit more subtle, because the namespacing in Rchain has to do with processes as contracts, right? So the fact that the processes that are being run as a result of instantiating definitions of smart contracts, they use channels to communicate, and those channels are they're also a way of locating data. And this idea of using channels, because you can convey or communicate data across channels, they become a way to locate data. And this idea is utilized when you give a process-based interpretation of collections. So if you want to implement a set as if it were a process, or if you want to implement a list as if it were a process, the insight that collections locate data is the key insight that goes on when we talk about realizing collections on top of the process calculi, like the row calculus. So when you look at that little paper that I wrote back in January on how you would implement lists or numbers or other kinds of collection types in Rolang, it uses this idea or this insight that was due to Robin Milner, that collections locate data. And so that then ties the thread through all the different concepts that we were talking about here, Jim. So
that's awesome. A channel can also be considered a collection, right? So
yes, you're absolutely right. So that's an even that makes things even more subtle and nuanced. You can think of a channel, at least in the row calculus or the pi calculus, as an unordered queue, where the message arrival order, the non-determinism of the message arrival order, is what corresponds to the no ordering in the queue.
Awesome.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was a great question. Cool. Any other questions, comments? Anything we want to talk about, or do we want to yield back the time to the community?
I thought I would mention the several folks on the marketing side are working on a messaging calendar. The primary themes that need to get communicated, and like the comments you made about the website, finding documents more readily and that kind of thing. Does Patrick, Lawrence, Nathan, anything you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah,
no,
so sorry. There's three themes that we want to do against the the marketing calendar is one, right, when are we going to be ready to have something that's demonstrable? So think of it as a matrix, right? When is, into Greg's earlier point, when can we push out all of the requests for people to start thinking about how they want to test? Because crowdsourcing the testing is a great idea. So how are we going to build a community, maybe a dedicated Slack channel for that? And then against the other side are articles and thought collateral education that we want to write. And Shingai is going to drive some of that. So the three of us are going to meet later this week. I want to publish that, and then we'll start circulate it internally before we publish it to the wider area. But if there are updates, as soon as you're going to do an update, because I can't see an automatic notification, just send me a link or copy me on email so that I know when something gets updated. I will push it out through LinkedIn, through other channels, so that we're starting to build community and cachet. And I also want to start getting it in front of the business community as well. Sorry, Nathan, you wanted to?
Yeah, we're also getting the mock-ups done for an initial wallet application, and we're Ed and Navneet and I have been working on that, as well as Shingai. So we're putting that together, and we're also working out what this would look like if it was more like a WeChat application where the social network was built into the wallet, or excuse me, vice versa, the wallet was actually built in the social network. So we're sort of scoping this out bit by bit.
That's pretty cool. That's really awesome. I think there's a lot of fertile area in trying to think about how wallets become social networks and social networks acquire wallets. I think this is a really interesting area. And
yeah, this is very much in line with the work that we're doing in the Digital Life Collective on the social ledger, which is we're putting it as a Mattermost integration where where the communication is a transaction, and there's in essence a currency associated with the communications. That's I think is very interesting.
Yeah. I agree. That's a very rich, fertile area. One of the things that I've wanted to kind of emphasize with Rchain is that I think we're going to have a lot of different features, right? I think there are going to be social kinds of features. There's going to be security and reliable messaging kinds of features. There's going to be financial kinds of features. And we should think about a kind of seamless spectrum of applications that are slightly different bundlings of those features. I mean, one way to think about it is if you go to your friendly neighborhood drugstore, whether it's Bartell's or Walgreens or whatever, it looks remarkably like a supermarket. Now, they have a slight bend towards being a drugstore, but the reality is that in order to just stay in business, they have to kind of expand the scope of what they do, and they start blending towards, being a supermarket. Likewise, supermarkets have and hardware stores and many other kinds of customer-facing distribution centers or retail centers begin to look a lot like each other, but there's slightly different bundlings or packagings of a series of features. The hardware store is leaning more towards one kind of thing, but you still find root beers and bubble gum and other things you might find in the supermarket on the hardware store shelves. And it's just because there's a more of a spectrum of needs, and the same is going to be true with respect to Rchain. There's a kind of spectrum of needs that sort of bundle the features slightly differently. And I think that, you know, the more we think about consciously engaging this, we can provide different kinds of on-ramps onto the network for different kinds of users. So in particular, I think there will be many users who come to the network from the social media, right? So they're not necessarily crypto savvy, but they hear about this decentralized social media kind of application, or you know, a decentralized music sharing service, and they're interested in music, and they're interested in social, and they're interested in decentralized, but they're not necessarily savvy or interested in crypto. But then they see how the crypto functions and features provide a much better experience and enable a sustainable kind of experience. You know, so that the economics of sharing music is more sustainable once you add the crypto features and functions, and so they become more interested in the crypto features and functions. On the other hand, there will be many crypto people who come to the platform trying to see whether or not it really does scale, or it really does prevent the DAO bug or the parity bug or whatever. But perforce, economic kinds of activities are social activities. I mean, that's at the root of economic activities, and so they're going to eventually want social networking kinds of features, or instant messaging kinds of features, or chat kinds of features, and so the bundling of these features across different applications, I think, is going to provide different kinds of on ramps for various user groups, and I think we can make a lot if we consciously engage this idea of different applications are really, they sort of smoothly blend towards one another.
I think Google has done an excellent job of creating a application integrated user experience. They started as essentially a browser, and 15 years later, now we have the Play Store, we have Google News, Google Drive, Calendar, Translate, and a bunch of different services that are all very much accessible from the Google, kind of home screen. So if we took kind of a similar approach and imagine, instead of a browser, our default service was a social media, or was a social network, where we provided the same kind of access to various services, would be, I think Google would be an excellent organization to model in terms of service integration. And in particular, media would be a very, very important, that's a very rich area, I think, considering a lot of the work that's been coming out of, say, University of Seattle, where people are working on digital manipulation software that allows certain people, say if you're given a recording of someone doing something, and you're given a subject that produces facial maneuvers that can be tracked, then you can impose the facial maneuvers of the subject onto the pre-recorded video. And you can do the same thing now with, I think, Voco under with audio. You can do the same thing with Adobe. So we're looking at kind of a media paradigm where you could see a video recording of someone that's by all means passable as someone actually doing that action or saying and doing those things, but is in fact someone else manipulating the images of that person to say those things. So if we imagine in the blockchain space then that we can verify cryptographically that from certain from certain sources or from certain namespaces, say that we have official cryptographically verified content that's been produced from, say, CNN, then that would integrate very well, I think, into like a blockchain-based media service. Just as one example of how we could integrate those services.
Yeah, no, that's great, Joe. I really like that. I like looking to Google as a kind of model for this thing that we're talking about, and also your example at the end. That's very nice. Cool, very good. Sorry I missed you on Friday. We were just like Skype tagging each other.
Yeah, maybe you have time before the dev stand-up. I have some pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool.
Very good. Let's see, what have we got? All right, so 5 minutes till. Any other questions, comments, thoughts that we want to touch base on before we sign off for this week?
Is this something we should be publishing? Because I didn't get the original invite. But can I push this out on social media?
But what, the Rchain community hangout?
This one, yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure, absolutely. I mean, we do have a kind of a publication stream. Just talk to Christian; he'll get you hooked up.
Yeah, the basic rule set I would say is I would prefer not the link to this room be publicly broadcasted on social media, but you can certainly publish the YouTube link, which I publish all the time in the Slack group. So for people who are in Slack, they're fine to join this room if they're in the community. But outside of that, I would say there's no problem, pushing out the YouTube link.
I guess in terms of composable applications, I think that's what you were sort of getting to in terms of the tailoring of applications for different applications of Rchain. And what I'm led to is sort of a radical tailorability that comes from the composable nature of contracts. Am I on the right track there?
As usual, your intuition is spot on, Jim. That's awesome. That's exactly right. I was trying out different language, but yes, that's exactly it. Well, we get this kind of ability to rapidly compose different applications because we can rapidly compose across feature sets using the compositional model that's built into the Rchain notion of contract, and more, and even more to the point, the kind of the boundaries with respect to autonomy and isolation versus coordination and communication are, they're exactly supported in the Rchain contracting notions. So yeah. This you're exactly on the right track. But it has, in my opinion, very significant translation of very significant business opportunities. And so that's why I wanted to take it from that angle.
The other angle is the personal angle and empowering the individual to radically tailor their interface to the applications that they're using.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Although I mean, I have to say that in terms of the user experience, there are sort of different subcultures around that. I think,
right. In terms of what we're doing with the Mattermost and such, what I'm looking at is blending the data and program so that your rules apply to your communications as you know, on going out as well as the application side, where you're looking to be a service provider on the chain.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just thinking about, you know, how, like in my current life, tinkering with an application, when I right now, I really don't want to tinker with the Ethereum wallet. I really just wish it would stay out long enough that I could pay the bills, right? You know, and it's just not on my list of priorities to tinker with the application. On the other hand, I think if I had a lot more time on my hands, I might actually spend a lot of time configuring applications. And so I think it really depends. Like, I know my 13-year-old son, who's totally into computers, he does a lot of tailoring and configuring because he has, you know, considerably more free time on his hands to do that. And that's what I was saying. I think that there are different demographics and different subcultures for which different kinds of tailoring is going to make more sense than others. But yeah, I think we're on the same page here.
Yeah.
Cool. So I think it's that time. I should definitely jump off because I've got a chock-a-block day full of meetings. But I really, as always, I really enjoyed the engagement today, and looking forward to seeing you guys next week. And there's a dev stand-up at 3 Pacific time today. Lawrence, would you like to join that?
Yes, please send me the invite.
Okay, will do. All right. Talk to you guys later.
Thanks for watching next night.
Bye.